Transform all your company's milestones, big or small, into impact with Impact Hero. Whether it's a sale, a new hire, a demo booked, or anything else, with Impact Hero, you automatically generate a gift that matters, like a tree planted, a kilo of plastic recovered, or a piece of coral reef restored. Join the hundreds of companies that are already boosting sales and retention while making an impact. Go to impacthero.com/podcast now to get 10% off. Again, that's impacthero.com/podcast to get 10% off. Welcome to another ClimateTech podcast, interviews with the people trying to save us from ourselves. Andreas Schwarzenbrunner heads up the ClimateTech and industrial tech practices at Speedinvest, one of Europe's leading venture capitalists. Together with Planet A Ventures and Norskin VC, they've released a very handy guidebook for hardware investing, which is what I reached them in Paris to talk about today. I'm Ryan Grant Little. Thanks for being here. Andreas, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. So you lead the climate tech and industrial tech investment practices at Speedinvest, which for those of us in Europe know it's one of Europe's elite VCs. Talk a bit about Speedinvest and what your day-to-day there looks like.
Yeah, happy to. So in a nutshell, we are an early stage technology investor. So we invest in pre-seed and seed companies, usually everything from 100,000 euros up to 3 million in the first round. We also really like to be involved very early on. We can also be in idea stage, first product, first customers, and then work very closely with our companies over the first 3, 4, 5 years. I would say that's a bit our sweet spot, and really try to help in this first 3, 4, 5 years to basically accelerate the company, de-risk the company, raise a proper Series A round, the Series B round. And we're usually not in the driver's seat anymore. So if everything goes right, so everything around our support around company building is focused on this 3, 4, 5 years. So we work on the board with them. We help them on hiring people. We have our own platform team that helps on business development with our corporate partners as well. So there's a lot of things that we do in this first 3, 4, 5 years. And then we can also follow on in our winners up to 20 million. So I think by now we also have some firepower to invest in our companies. Within technology, we have 6 focus areas that we do. It's healthcare, marketplaces, consumer, software as a service, deep tech, industrial and climate tech, and fintech. And I'm leading the climate and industrial tech investments. So that is everything that is in energy, mobility, agriculture, food, construction, real estate, manufacturing, circular economy. So all the big emitters. And also there we focus on pre-seed and seed investments. The firm is actually by now, 2024, so 13 years old. We started 2011, actually in Vienna of all places. It's not usually a startup hub. Started especially in Austria and a bit of Eastern Europe. So we did investments in Slovenia, Hungary, and also Bulgaria, Croatia. And that was actually the beginning because there was not a lot of competition there. There were no VCs really in Austria and CE, and that's why we started to do a lot of investments there. And then we moved more and more with success and a bit also with maturity. We moved more into more established markets, opened up our first office in Germany, in Munich in 2015, and then Berlin, London, and Paris followed over the years. And by now we invest all across Europe and also in emerging markets. And so that's a bit the evolution of Speedinvest, so to say.
And what's your background? What got you into investing?
That happened pretty randomly, actually. So I have actually a background in economics and always wanted to work in politics, which I also did. So I always wanted to work either for the European Central Bank or for the European Commission. That was actually my dream. I worked then in politics, first in the Austrian Parliament and also then shortly for a member of the European Parliament. What I realized in my time in politics is basically that I was always like giving advice, producing a lot of paper, actually not really making decisions. It was very slow moving. It was very bureaucratic. And my idea of maybe I do then a PhD at the side and then I go in the ECB, I realized like it's probably not a work environment where I'm going to be happy, and it's not going to be something that I love doing. And that's why I was always looking for other opportunities and really thought like, okay, what can I do if, let's say, this dream of working in politics is actually not really a fit, which was for me a bit disappointing because I was always very engaged in politics since I was 15. And all my friends from university days actually moved into tech because it was the first big wave of startups in Berlin. It was the whole era still of work at the internet, and the first startups really popped up. People either joined the startup or maybe were early employees, co-founded a startup, or worked for big tech like Meta or Alphabet. And their world always sounded way more exciting than my world. And because they had like office parties and a young crowd, very international, very fast paced. You are like 24 and you can just do stuff and so on. And that was everything that politics is not really, or public service is not really. And then I actually met a friend for lunch, and this led me to Speedinvest. And so he was also in the tech ecosystem. He knew Speedinvest a bit. And he said, hey, there's this small Austrian fund. They are going to expand because they want to raise a second fund. The first one was 10 million, was quite small, was only our founders. And they want to raise a second fund and they want to build up a team. Maybe that's interesting for you because it's a good combination of a bit this, let's say, more macro view, but also this startup tech world. And then through a common connection, I reached out and also to one of the co-founders. And then I had my first interviews, and with Oliver, also then our CEO and founder. And actually, I think I was lucky in two sides. So first of all, I think I had no real competition. So no one really knew about Speedinvest and what we're doing. And VC was also not that hot back then yet. So that really helped. So it was not, and the second was I had a really fun conversation with Oliver and we really vibed. And so he gave me a shot and I was hired as the first analyst that didn't really exist before at Speedinvest. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And never left.
Well, you landed on your feet there. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about, and the reason we're talking today, is that you've just, together with Planet A Ventures and Norskin VC, launched, and I'll quote the title here, Building and Scaling Climate Hardware, a Playbook. And I think this is something that's really important for the sector and for investors who maybe are more used to investing in software and SaaS and this type of thing. And as we're collectively trying to wrap our heads around kind of the challenges of hardware investing. And this is the culmination of interviews with 118 investors and 142 founders, as well as 9 years of market intelligence covering 3,600 funding announcements, and I should say all with a focus on Europe. How did this come together? What was the impetus for this? Whose idea was it, and why do we need it?
So how excited was actually that there is a real influx of capital in the climate tech space over the last few years, right? There's climate tech funds popping up left, right, and center. And there is more generalistic funds that moved more and more into climate. Like we are also one of those, right? Because we also do other things. And what I realized is always that when you talk to them bilaterally, they're always like, yeah, but we actually prefer software, right? And there's a reason for that because it's easier to scale and multiples are higher and so on. And we can come to that later. But I also realized, and we realized at Speedinvest, that in order to really change the way we do things, the way we produce things, the way we get around and really help this transition to a zero carbon economy, you need to touch physical stuff, right? At one point in time, you need to touch physical stuff. Otherwise, it's impossible. And this is where it kind of stopped a bit, right? A lot of investors don't really want to do that. Founders are also a bit afraid of doing that. Things are not really scaling. There's a lot of research, but there's not that much capital into it. And there's this gap between you're coming out of research and you're getting a lot of grants until you're really mature and you can raise a lot of money, like, for example, Climeworks does. There's a certain scale where it works again, but there's this gap in between. And we thought we really need to do something in order also to get more investors feeling comfortable with investing in hardware and also helping founders, especially, to understand what are the things they need to look out for in order to be attractive for investors, and how can they de-risk their model and how can they go about it. And our goal really is to get more capital into, let's say, these earlier phases of scaling hardware and enabled climate technologies. And also for us, something that we needed to learn. We did a few investments, for example, one in direct air capturing technology, one in sustainable packaging, a few others. It comes with very different challenges than a classic software business. And that was a bit our goal. We really want to help the market to be more educated about it.
The first sentence of the handbook is hardware is hard. And I think that encapsulates a lot and is well put. And I've got some ideas about why that's the case. But maybe talk about why that is. You just alluded to that a little bit, but talk about why that is, and especially maybe for investors who've been focused on software for the past 25 years and why it's different.
Yeah, it's, by the way, one of the first sentences I learned at Speedinvest. When I joined, we looked at a company, I can't remember why it was, but one of our founders told me, yeah, but remember, hardware is hard. So it's been in the ecosystem for quite a while. Why is that? I think, first of all, we built up, an ecosystem of entrepreneurs and operators over the last 15 years in Europe, which is, I think, that there has been massive change in the European startup ecosystem in the last 15 years, and it really matured. And you see now more serial founders, you see very seasoned operators, etc. But almost all of them were in software, right, or digital services and or consumer and marketplaces. And they didn't really have the skills, or they don't really have the skills to scale hardware and very capex intense business models, which is quite interesting because on the other hand, we have a really strong industrial core, especially in the German speaking region. So there are companies who know how to produce stuff and do things and do this at an excellent level, right? And I think we need to combine these two worlds a bit more together, like this entrepreneurial mindset with the traditional industrial core who knows how to produce stuff and do this at scale. And I think why it's hard for investors is it's quite straightforward. I think it takes a lot of money. It takes more time. There's a lot of risk along this path that it doesn't work out or things go wrong, etc. And usually when you exit a company or when you IPO it and you look at companies also that, produce energy storage or hydrogen, etc., that are publicly listed, multiples for such a company are also way lower than they are for a software company. And that means that the outcome for an investor is potentially lower with more risk and more capital investment, which is usually an equation that doesn't really make sense for an investor if you think about it. And I think this is also, or is the main reason why a lot of investors shy away from it. And this is also exactly what happened in, let's say, CleanTech 1.0 in the first wave 15 years ago, or actually 20 years ago when it started. I wasn't really involved, but from all the stories that I heard is exactly what happened, right? A lot of investors burned a lot of money because it took a longer time to scale those companies. It was very capital intense and the outcomes were mediocre. And then performance was mediocre. And then a lot of investors came to the conclusion ClimateTech is actually not really an interesting investment area, which, by the way, I think is the reason why it's called ClimateTech, because it used to be called CleanTech. But CleanTech is has such a negative connotation. No one wants to talk about CleanTech. So everyone calls it ClimateTech. I think actually we're all talking about the same thing. I mean, there are some differences, but yeah.
Yeah, I was a founder in 1.0 and dealing with that funding environment. I founded a biogas company in 2006, which we sold in 2010. And it was hell, the funding environment there. We had, funders who didn't really kind of understand this. We were trying to stack the capital in very novel ways. And, it was very capital intensive. We're building, our first plant was $30 million. And there was just no blueprint for kind of how to do this. And
the great financial crisis, right, then hit probably, that was not helpful.
Yeah. And we were the last investment of an investor that in 2008 had a commitment pulled pretty majorly. And so it went from the mantra of let's plan for success. And I would ask, should we really be spending this amount of money on our team when we're pre-revenue? Ryan, you have to plan for success. And then the next day it became, why are we spending so much money on it? So, It was a different environment. 2008 was, it's in the past now. And so we kind of forget sometimes, but it was a bloodbath out there, right? It's really just, it was insane.
It's funny that you say that because I had a conversation with one of my founders and basically we had this board meeting and he said yeah, now all of you told me for years, like, you need to grow, grow, grow. And now all of a sudden everyone is like, why are you not profitable?
Yeah, it's whatever the flavor is, and it's a lot about the capital availability and
Exactly.
interest rates and these types of things. And we have short memories for this kind of stuff. But I'm interested to talk a little bit more about this. So this term pops up a lot, 1.0 versus, I guess now we're in kind of climate tech or clean tech 2.0. And there was a number that 90% of investments in 1.0 didn't return their initial capital in that phase, which is probably why some investors are still gun shy about investing in this space. I'm wondering what's different now in 2.0 that means we're not going to replicate those failures or mediocrity.
Before I start with that, I think that there's also a slight misconception, because if you remember, for example, Kleiner Perkins was one of the first large investors in, let's say, cleantech 1.0, and they were really at the forefront of this. And for years, people said like the returns are shitty and it didn't really work out. It was basically one of the picture perfect example of this cleantech 1.0 bubble. But if you look at the Kleiner Perkins numbers of that portfolio now, actually, a lot of those companies matured and grew really, really well and are now public listed companies. It just took way longer. But the performance now, if you look at it over the last 20 years, it's actually not that bad. So they didn't lose money. So they actually returned money and it was not that bad, which I think is interesting. It also shows that it just really takes time. I think what has changed, I think a few things. First of all, prices have come down massively. If you look at, battery storage, if you look at solar, if you look at soon probably hydrogen. So I think a lot of fundamental technologies that are needed for the energy and climate transition as prices have come down massively. Technology has improved also massively. So there's a lot of things that we can do now, let's say, also with the help of AI and other things, but the software side and the technology has improved. There are a lot of things feasible now that have not been feasible. Third, I think that there is regulatory pressure to do stuff. So even in the US, if you look at the IRA, but also especially in Europe. So there is this clear will to transform to a zero carbon economy. And yes, it will probably take longer than the targets are, but there is the clear will, and there's momentum and there's regulatory pressure. The fourth, I think, is also consumer behavior has changed massively. I was traveling through Switzerland by train 2 weeks ago from France to Switzerland. And I was looking out of the window and it was incredible. Like every house had a solar panel on the roof, like really literally every house. And of course, this is also due to government subsidies and so on. But you see that people are changing, and also this whole like people don't want EVs, I think is bullshit. I think that once you have driven an EV, people realize it's actually quite nice.
Yep.
And the same is true for other areas where we see like people consume, less meat and so on. So I think that the consumer behavior has also changed. And the fifth point that I would mention is the amount of capital that is now going into the ecosystem is just so immense compared to like literally every day you see a big asset manager announcing investments in, infrastructure, renewable infrastructure, in clean tech, etc. So there are a lot of, I think, driving forces why I think this time it has very, very different momentum. But I also think that there will be companies that will face the same destiny as companies in cleantech 1.0.
Yeah, going back to 2006, I mean, a lot of that 1.0 was on the heels of Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. That was a watershed moment, but it's probably not enough to sustain a whole industry. And there wasn't really the kind of regulatory framework or, public desire for this stuff that's needed, and that I think we have now, where it feels like climate change is a bit more of a pressing issue these days. And indeed, you mentioned Kleiner Perkins. That was the only Silicon Valley company or investor that was interested in our space at that time. I remember being there on Sand Hill Road and meeting with them, and they're very curious. And I think at the time they called it resilience that they were investing in. So there was that was the topic that they put all their clean tech stuff into. And indeed, they've done pretty well. And as you say, it's just taken a bit longer. Do you have any kind of numbers when you're looking at this space these days and going forward? You mentioned there's lots of capital being poured into this space. Can you kind of fill that picture out a little bit? I work with a lot of companies who plan to open up shop in or expand across Europe. My one big piece of advice: don't fall into the trap of setting up a new entity right away. Instead, talk to my friends at Paracar, who can help you get up and running without all the costs, not to mention the legal and HR hassle. When I was hiring in different EU countries, I wanted my team to focus on their work, not on the country's bureaucracy. After interviewing a half dozen international expansion firms, I chose Paracar because they were by far the most knowledgeable and they're great people. Whether you're a large multinational looking to expand abroad, a small business looking for the right talent, or a contractor, they'll sort it out. Book a free, no-obligation consultation right now at paracar.eu/climate. That's PARAKAR.eu/climate.
That's a good question. I don't know by heart, but what we see in Europe is that the proportion of investments in climate tech and in energy has risen massively over the last 3 years. So the relative proportion of investments in VC is more going into climate and especially energy. Energy is a super hot topic in Europe. I mean, obviously also to the Ukraine war, there is just a real momentum for energy investments in Europe. And also the amount of capital has increased, and also new funds that popped up over the last 3-4 years. So for what we see in our data, in deal flow, but also on our portfolio side, financing rounds, etc., we actually see that climate tech is most resilient in terms of there's still rounds happening at high valuations. There's lots of momentum. There's lots of investors' interest. So for us, it's actually quite interesting to see because we have so many different teams, right? So we have a very broad view, I think, of the market is to see that in climate, there's still a lot of momentum, although the rest of the VC market is probably not in the best spot at the moment.
And so energy, I think, is still the number one absorption of capital in this space. What are some of the other verticals within ClimateTech that you're looking at SpeedInvest? And maybe if you can talk about some of the deals that you've done or types of deals you're looking at.
Yeah. So for us, there's basically how we clustered it are sectors that are also the big polluters. So for us, it's on the one hand, mobility, transport, logistics, which is a big driver. The second is agriculture, food. The third is manufacturing and circular economy. It's about how can we decrease energy consumption in production? How can we production make more efficient, but also how can we reuse and recycle materials in a value chain? And then we have the whole energy topic, which is, of course, the whole transition to renewables, but also all the topics attached to that, like from grid to balancing to storage to whatever, to new forms like hydrogen. And so there's a lot of topics around, let's say, energy transition. And the fifth one for us is construction real estate. 40% of energy consumption in Europe is heating and cooling buildings. How can we make buildings more efficient? How can we also improve materials? How can we improve how to build buildings? How to be more efficient about materials? So I think this is an important area also for us, where we, for example, recently did an investment in a company that helps institutional investors to transform their buildings from brown to green assets. So at the moment, there's a big pressure for institutional investors to renovate buildings. And it's also a big driver and a big goal of the European Union. So, for example, what they do is they make an assessment of the building. They tell you what the decarbonization path looks like. So if you want to get to energy efficiency class B, this is what it looks like. This is what it would cost. This is what the subsidies would be. Then they take care of the whole process, including the construction of it. And then basically it's a one-stop shop that helps institutional investors to transform their portfolio from brown to green buildings, so to say. And that's an area where we've seen a lot of stuff, from like heat pumps to solar, but also like ESG management for buildings, energy management, software for buildings. So that's an area where we've seen a lot of things that is quite interesting for us. Also, for example, another example on our construction angle is we have been invested in a company called Shitflix that does the procurement of bulk materials and construction materials to construction site. But what the big driver in construction is actually the disposal and recycling of materials. And this is what they're now doing. So they basically take materials from a construction, a demolition site, and then also recycle that materials. And a lot of that materials can be recycled and be resold. And how can you really create a loop where materials actually get reused, get recycled and reused? The same is, for example, true what we look at in a circular, what we call circular economy, a company called Resourcify. They really created an operating system for corporates to manage all their waste streams. Not only have an overview of all your waste streams, and not only have be compliant with the regulatory environment, but also then, for example, what they do with Johnson & Johnson as a customer is they manage the whole loop. So they take care that the plastic waste from hospitals goes back to a recycler, that goes to a factory of Johnson & Johnson, that goes back to the hospital. So basically they manage the whole loop so that the plastic in that process of materials in healthcare products gets reused and recycled. And so they really built this operating system for a circular economy, which is, for example, one example. So there's many, we invested in around 30 companies for everything from sustainable packaging to solar, but also energy procurement is another one. For example, recently announced fundraising round with Trava. They help SMEs to procure energy cheaper, procure also cleaner energy, and manage their energy consumption smarter. So there's a broad area of topics in those five core verticals, I would say. Usually, as said, come in early and then have the capacity to follow on. But yeah, I think it's, for me and for us, it's a super exciting space. But there's so much things happening, and it's also really exciting to invest in stuff that is actually really meaningful. And you think like, oh, this has really an impact, right? First time, for example, 1.5, our company that does sustainable packaging, they work with big brands on also products that you know in the supermarket, right? And the first time they sent me the samples of these products actually via mail to my home. And I looked at it and I was like, it's so cool, right? When you see this like company from an idea stage to you have this product in your hand and like, oh, that's actually like 100% sustainable packaging, which is really cool. And which is, by the way, another thing, why hardware investments are cool, because
you get to touch them.
You can go there, you can see, you can feel it, you can see it. I think it's a cool experience. It's also when we looked at the facilities on the recycling of construction material. It's cool. For me, it was cool. You know, if you come from the software world, it's also a really nice experience to see how, let's say, real things are done.
Yeah. I remember putting on my construction hat and walking for the first time, walking through the plant that I built. And that's, that's different than,
It must be a cool feeling.
It is. Yeah. It's something a bit more tangible than logging into a Chrome browser.
Yeah, exactly.
So if your first love is politics, a lot of this stuff has a policy angle, and the EU is probably, as far as global jurisdictions go, one of the leaders in at least kind of trying to think about this stuff. To what extent do you get involved now with policy, or how closely do you watch how policy is being created when you're looking at investments?
It's, by the way, where my two worlds, let's say that this policy and politics world, and we see basically interfered the most was really on the ClimateTech side, right? Because I realized, like, especially on the ClimateTech side, that so many of our investments are driven by policy, and also so much of this market is driven by politics and policy. And then I think that is also, for me, quite cool, where it's the first time where I really think that, oh, my connections from back then, or what I learned back then, is actually somehow useful to also startups. And I realized that a lot of startups especially really have no idea how policies are being done or how politics work. It's really incredible when you talk to them, like how far they off of public service. But I think, so how we get engaged is, I would say, more. So, for example, I've been in a dinner with the European Commissioner that is also in charge of the ESC program. And we're part of as a deep tech initiative there, and how we really can scale up deep tech in Europe from really, let's say, a seed stage to solving this capital crunch for real innovation. So there are a few things where we get engaged with. Same also with different ministries in the core countries where we are active, and really try to be more involved in the debate, mostly around, I think, really how can we solve this capital crunch for innovation and for technology and scaling technologies in Europe, because I think that's where, of course, we have the most expertise. And there are a lot of other things you can tackle as well, from education system to other areas. But there are a few areas that are important for us where we really try to be engaged in the debate and really try to help. Because I think it's important that people are available, so to say, because policy always looks also for counterparts. They want to hear what the real world problems are, and they want to hear and you need to be engaged in that debate. Although sometimes it's, of course, a bit frustrating because it sounds often like a never ending story. You always tell the same things and then you come back next year and it's the same things again. But I think it's also part of the game and you need to keep on pushing. And for us, it's actually something where we also internally discuss that we even want to do more, want to be more engaged, right, on a European level, because we think that at the moment there's Europe has so much potential. Actually, we have a strong education system. We have strong talent. Every US investor also would tell you the same. We have really cool companies that produce really cool stuff. But what we're really bad at is scaling this up, capitalizing those companies properly, also bring academic research to commercialization and build businesses out of it. But the funny thing is that the capital is there. I mean, there's so much capital in Europe in the wrong channels, right? I mean, countries like Germany, France, Italy still sit on so much capital because, I mean, we used to be the richest countries in the world, right? So there's still so much capital. It's just not really invested in high growth assets and in technology. And I think if we can change this, there's you can really unlock a new era of I always call it European dynamism because there's this American dynamism fundraising. And I said, yeah, we also need European dynamism because, and I think that's doable. And that's why, for example, in France, I really like that there is at least people try to do stuff, which also for me shows, and I think should be a good role model for people, how fast it can change. Because when I started in venture, no one cared about France. France was a very closed ecosystem, French investors for French companies, and everyone out of France was told, don't go to France if you're not French. And now Paris is the hottest shit in the European startup world. And US investors are flying in to invest in Paris-based companies. So you can change stuff if you want to. It's doable. And I think we need the mindset to say, okay, let's change stuff in order that Europe is thriving again.
So for European investors who are listening, and there are a bunch of them, and who are nervous about getting into hardware investing, as someone who's crossed the Rubicon on this, what is your advice for them? What's the best way for them to get started?
Yeah, I think just get started is the first advice probably. But no, for us, the most important is definitely the team here. So we need to have someone where we believe they can scale that. So they know how to play that game. So that means in different mix of financing. So from grants to project financing to debt, etc. So how do they approach this different kind of financing? How do they structure the financing mix? Are they aware of this, etc.? So I think if you have someone who has no idea about that, right, it's hard. You need to educate them. It's hard. Of course, you can support, but it's a very crucial part of scaling hardware. The second is really production experience. Depends a bit, of course, what you're doing. But if you really want to build, let's say, a test factory and then you build another factory. For example, we invest in a company called Silex. They do lithium-ion battery recycling. They tested this on a lab scale. They tested this on a small pilot production. So that's how you usually go about. They're now rolling this out to their first big production. They raised a 50 million round now to really scale this. And what for us was super important is, of course, that you have people on the team. And it does not necessarily need to be the founder team, but people on the team who come from manufacturing, who know how to set up such a factory, and who know how to scale that. Because you can do a lot of mistakes. It can take a lot of time. It can cost a lot of money if you don't do it right. So I think this production experience is crucial. The third is for us always trying to de-risk it with corporate customers. So basically, if either it's an off-take agreement, so they know. So for example, in the case of Silent, we know that if they produce the lithium out of their recycling factory at that certain quality grade, then we know that there is a German OEM who will buy that. So of course they didn't buy anything yet because there's nothing coming out yet, but we know if they achieve that, there's a customer. And I think for a lot of, we had the same for a sustainable packaging company with a big FMCG brand. So they said, if you can fulfill that certain criteria and produce at that quality, we take X and we pay you Y. And that at least gives you that, so to say, that the comfort that if it works, there's a market for it. And I think those would be for us the three main areas that we look at.
And then the fourth one would be to read this handbook, which I definitely recommend. A great piece of work. I really enjoyed reading it. And
it took a lot of time actually. And also a big kudos to the whole team here involved, because there were many people involved. And especially also from North Carolina Plant A and Sophia from our team. And she was great in doing that.
Any big surprises or aha moments in all of those interviews with founders and investors?
I wouldn't say surprises, but a big confirmation that if you look at what the founders say the biggest challenges are, there was a very clearly over 70% people said fundraising. And also people said how to scale up production. And the outcome of our interviews and so on really was showing or confirming our view a bit on the market. And that's also interesting. And it also on the one hand makes it easier because it also shows clearly what are the things to work on. If you now have the data really that those are the bottlenecks and those are the problems.
So it's called Building and Scaling Climate Hardware, a Playbook. And I'll, of course, link it in the show notes. Andreas, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Juan. It was a great chat.
Thanks for listening to another ClimateTech podcast. It would mean a lot if you would subscribe, rate, and share this podcast. Get in touch anytime with tips and guest recommendations at hello@climatetechpod.com. Find me, Ryan Grant Little, on LinkedIn. I'll be back with another episode next week. Bye for now. This episode is supported by Grizzle, B2B content to create and capture demand. I first met Grizzle's founder, Tom Watley, 5 years ago at a conference in Dublin. I was so impressed that I signed a deal with him to do all my software company's content that same evening at the pub. Remember that, Tom?
Kinda.
And they're still doing it 2 years after we sold the company because the new owners love Grizzle as much as I do. If you sell B2B, book 30 minutes in Tom's calendar at grizzle.io/climate. That's GRIZZLE.io/climate.